Welcome, everyone, to the Edith Wheeler Memorial Library. This is session number 2 of the Art Gottlieb Lecture on the 20th Century by Decade, Part 1. I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, the Friends of the Library, for this program. And now, without further ado, please welcome Art Gottlieb.
How are you, everyone? I'd like to thank everyone for their understanding about our last session. My wife's kid brother suffered a freak accident, and as a 63-year-old, perfectly healthy, wound up being flown to an emergency center. Then he was paraplegic, and he wasn't going to have any really hope of being able to move anymore, and suffered complication after complication. And exactly the time of our last presentation it was 2 weeks ago. At 2:00, we were on a teleconference with the hospital, and my wife was saying her goodbyes to her kid brother. And then within an hour and a half, approximately, he passed away. So Edith Wheeler was very gracious, and they bumped it. So here we are. Thank you again. Now, I've got a good one for you. Our decade is from 1909 approximately to 1919, 1920. And I can't think of a more significant period of time in history. I mean, every period of time is significant, but this one particularly, because the world that we live in was created during this time. I'm going to break this down into a few different parts to utilize the time that we have, the hour and a half. So the overall point about this particular era, that time around World War I, is we entered this era as if it was the last part of the last century. And this part, after World War I, we became part of the modern world. That's the important part to remember. Hold on a second. I'm just going to shut this door. Okay, sorry about that. And in 1909, 1910, the world was essentially living in the same way it was in the 19th century, really. We had some more modern things. We had, the newfangled automobile, and we had electricity. Not every place was electrified, of course. I mean, the area that I'm sitting here up in northern Norwalk, right by the Merritt Parkway, I mean, this wasn't electrified till probably 1927, 1928. So people were still essentially living as they were in the 19th century. What really changed everything was the technology that we had of the day, in the form of, I guess the greatest example that I'm going to talk about would be a ship like the Titanic, and say, and the attitudes that went along with it. Now, as you know, the Titanic sank in 1912. And but when World War I rolled along, that is something that the world after World War I was now in the modern era. And before World War I, we were still in the 19th century, essentially. So, like I said, I'm going to break this down. In Europe, during this period of time, you still had monarchs. We still had things that were done with the pomp and circumstances as they always had been done in old Europe. The United States was the New World, of course, and we were still separated by a very large open ocean. This period of time was still considered one where, Europe was Europe and the United States was the United States. When World War I rolled around, we became more compressed as a globe, in a way that never existed before, and certainly has remained so. That's on steroids now, of course, because of computer, where boundaries and oceans really are meaningless. They're just dots on a line. Just dotted lines on a map. So in our technology age, the kind of notion of, well, we live in one country and you live all the way on the other side of the ocean now is now meaningless. It's something to always remember. You probably heard me say before that when I'm speaking to people under, say, I don't know, 30 years old, there's a different perception about nationalism. There's a different perception about identity. Because if you spent your entire life on the internet, then those are really just arbitrary things, as far as boundaries are concerned, or oceans even. So Europe, if you've ever seen, I like the movie Titanic, the last one with Leonardo DiCaprio, etc. It's a good one in a sense because it really showed the kind of class differences that existed on board the Titanic, which were, really dramatically illustrated in that movie, where you had the first class people who were, Billy Zahn played, the most egregious character in that regard, and he was easy to hate with his utter contempt for everyone who was born underneath his particular social class. And then, of course, the people who were in third class or steerage on the Titanic, they wouldn't even unlock the doors, so the ship was sinking. And, well, maybe some of the third class people got up on deck and maybe they didn't. So there really was this heavy duty, old fashioned class structure that existed in Europe. And that's not something that changed during World War I. It's just something to recall. A big difference between Europe and the United States. We at least had the idea that one could transcend their social class. And we were the first time in history that the middle class even became available to the average person, if you were able to skirt our prejudices and whatever other social or economic barriers there might be. But you had the Tsar in Russia, and you had kings and queens, like I said. And when World War I rolled around in 1914, it is a period of time we look at today. We look at this. And there was a famous book that was written, I think it was in the around 1960, called The Guns of August. And it essentially talked about how you had all of these empires in Europe that had aligned themselves with each other politically, socially, economically, and it created this unstoppable set of dominoes that fell as soon as Archduke Franz Ferdinand got killed. And maybe sometime we'll do a program on World War I. We'll get into that a little bit more detail. But one thing happened, and because of the series of alliances, you wound up with this unbelievable war that, historically we look at and in real time was considered completely unnecessary. I mean, what did World War I solve, essentially, as far as politics is concerned, and the reason why it was fought? And by the end of the war in 1918, the world was a different place. And one of those things that had changed along that way is the fact that the United States announced itself as a world power, in European politics, right? And this is the first time that the United States was really involved in European affairs. And that was under, of course, President Wilson. Now, President Wilson is a very important character in this period of time because he literally shaped the modern American way of doing things right to this very moment. In my opinion, say, for instance, President Biden right now, and along with world affairs that are going on right now, is channeling, in my opinion, I didn't ask the man, but in my opinion, he's channeling Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson is who I'm getting to at the moment. Woodrow Wilson created a tremendous hinge point for the United States in 1916. What Woodrow Wilson did was he went to Congress and asked Congress to declare a state of war against Germany. And this was really unprecedented on a number of levels for Americans anyway, because we were going to declare war on a major power, and that we weren't at war with. Right now, people might say, well, what about they sank the Lusitania? Did they, the Germans? Right, but that really wasn't the cause of our joining World War I, not entirely by a long shot. Woodrow Wilson made the case to Congress that the United States should enter World War I and declare war on Germany. And this is the important sentence to remember: to make the world safe for democracy. So for the first time, it was articulated, and it became the mission of the United States, and I would argue right to the present moment, in a straight line, that it is the United States' responsibility to protect and support democracies around the world, and to literally do whatever we have to do to ensure their survival, no matter what point of involvement we have to be involved. You see, and that actually goes straight back to 1916. That was the purpose of the war, to make the world safe for democracy. And the kind of rhetoric that goes on right now is the United States is the indispensable nation. And what they're talking about is exactly what Woodrow Wilson talked about. And it's a straight line, straight right back to that moment. So the United States now becomes involved in World War I, and we were just an associate power, incidentally. We weren't a major ally. Of course, we always consider ourselves to be allies. And the truth was we were allies and we were allied, but really we were just merely an associate power. We were really just a second-tier player in World War I. And of course, I think it could be argued that without us, that World War I might well have been ended in some kind of a negotiated settlement by the Germans and the French and the English, right? If the United States hadn't entered World War I, that probably would have been the case. So the discussion I'd like to have with you is how the world changed, specifically because the United States became involved in World War I and tips the balance of power in favor of the Allies, and made it so that, and this is the important point, that the Germans had to surrender. You see, right there. That is what created every single thing after that point. The fact that the Germans had to surrender because the Americans joined the war and gave the extra manpower to the British and the French. And the Germans now weren't involved in a negotiated peace. They were involved in a surrender, right? So in other words, Great Britain and France won, Germany lost. And in the European tradition of things, which is very much different than our perception of things as Americans, certainly in a Wilsonian sense, the victor takes all, and the vanquished goes home with whatever the vanquished is left with. And that's just the way the cookie crumbles, you see? And right at that moment, at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, when all of that was articulated in the Treaty of Versailles, it began the Second World War. The ink wasn't dry on the Treaty of Versailles before the seeds were sown for the rest of the century, in the form of the rise of fascism, the rise of Hitlerism, the fall of the Ottoman Empire because of the end of World War I, and the fall of the Ottoman Empire. You can draw a straight line right back to what's going on in the news at this very moment regarding the Middle East and Zionism and the state of Israel, right? And people's resentment towards the state of Israel, if you feel that way. And there's a surprising amount of people, in my opinion, that do feel that way, that the state of Israel doesn't really have a right to exist. I had somebody remarkably in one of my presentations about 2 weeks ago when I was talking about this subject, who practically stormed out and left because I suggested that the state of Israel had a right to exist. So you'd be surprised. Or maybe you wouldn't. But that goes right back to our decade that we're talking here today. And so you see how pivotal this all is. Additionally, Russia, which the United States essentially bribed to stay in the war as long as possible, if you didn't know that, under Wilson's presidency, Russia finally bowed out. And the fact that they stayed in the war, the Russians, created a situation of tension inside Russia that made it possible for Lenin to come to power and the Bolshevik Revolution to take place. And therefore, that was going to, so if you didn't have Lenin, you didn't have Bolshevism, you never would have had Stalin, you see. So essentially, America's intervention in World War I effectively changed the course of history worldwide, because the United States under Wilson said that the United States' role is to affect world events from this moment forward. And it certainly did. And it has ever since. Another couple of things is, well, from 1918 to 1920, we had this little thing called the Spanish flu, right? Which got some historical press and some airtime and some ink because we just went through a little bit of a pandemic of our own, if you remember that. So it was, geez, it was 100 years earlier, right? Almost to the century, where they had this massive pandemic. And that was from 1918 to 1920. And the numbers are very, very sketchy. I mean, there's no way that anybody worldwide can estimate how many people died from the actual flu. But it was estimated to be up to 100 million people worldwide. And so starting at the beginning, the Titanic. Right. Now, there's a subject that I like to talk about because I like to talk about ships, you know that. But the Titanic represented the time that it existed in a way that's important to discuss here. If you were going to have some object that was going to show the flag around the rest of the world about what your country represented, it would be one of those big ocean liners, right? And they were those big ocean liners. The British, of course, had two major lines. They had the Cunard Line and the White Star Line, later to merge, of course, like so many different things like railroads. And the British, the Germans, had their own huge ocean liner lines, right? The Hapag-Lloyd line, etc. And these were competing not only in business, but they were competing in the stature of nations. And we can look back at this period of time where there was a tremendous national pride that went along with these enormous floating objects. I mean, for instance, the Titanic was the biggest man-made object that was capable of moving, you see, during its stay. And it brought with it the embodiment of everything that was British: culture, design, technology, heritage, quality of food, the way that things were done, certain efficiencies or the lack thereof. Everything was pumped into these ships. And the Germans, to say the least, I mean, it was the same exact thing. I mean, the German ships looked like Bavarian hotels, when they had these big oaken fireplaces, and it was like being in Germany in some kind of an inn. And this was a period of time where there was this race for technology and building these ships, right? So you had ocean liners, and also there was a tremendous competition in the early parts of this decade and throughout this decade of naval construction, right? So naval construction, like today, we don't think about it very much. There's only a few big yards that are building ships here in the United States. Newport News in Connecticut, of course, which was always technology based. We have Naturally Electric Boat Company, right? But you don't really get to see a nuclear submarine being built. Right? Back in these days, I mean, the ship took up an entire yard, and it was the pride of a whole, not only a nation, but an entire town, right? And everybody in that town worked at the shipyard. And I guess the closest thing we would have probably up here in New England would be like Bath Iron Works, if you've ever been up there, where we build a lot of United States Navy destroyers. I mean, it's just more than a job, it is a heritage. And Kaiser Wilhelm over in Germany was the grandson of Queen Victoria and spent his youth on the knee of Queen Victoria with the rest of his cousins, watching the British regalias, right? And all of these things and the pomp and the circumstances of the greatest navy on earth, right? Since Nelsonian times, that the Britannia rules the waves. And as a German, Kaiser Wilhelm wanted that for Germany, which put him, of course, in immediate competition with the Royal Navy, right? Because if the Royal Navy is being usurped by the Germans in the quality and the quantity and the size and the capability of its warships, it's an arms race. And that's exactly what you had. And it was a predominant feature. It was really, this is the first arms race. And it was the technology of the day made it possible to build larger and larger weapons. And the Germans built them, and then the British countered, and then the Germans countered what the British had built, and you essentially had an arms race. And it's no different than the stuff we're talking about today. And well, China and has bested us, and Russia has bested us, and something called hypersonic missiles. I do programs on John F. Kennedy all the time. And John F. Kennedy, during the campaign of 1960, for the 1960 presidency, election that is, had accused the Eisenhower administration and Vice President Nixon, who was going to be his opponent in 1960, of course. Kennedy had accused them of dereliction of duty, essentially, by allowing the United States to fall behind the Soviet Union in the manufacture and design of what? Intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so this kind of thing goes right back to the period of time we're talking about. It's an arms race. Who's got the better technology? Who's scrapping the obsolete stuff? How politically do you get your country to spend millions and millions and millions of dollars on this military hardware where it doesn't seem as though there's a clear and present danger? You see, and it's the same political situation we have today. The United States emerged from World War II, de facto as the world's first real superpower with nuclear weapons. And the Western world had handed over its sovereignty of protecting itself to the United States. So since the end of World War II, the United States has assumed the role of literally protecting all of the Western world, right? The so-called democracies, if that's what they are. And that's where we're asking ourselves right at the moment, is that still valid? Can we afford it anymore at $33 trillion in debt? And is it worth it to remain the hegemonic power of the Pacific as we were at the end of World War II, which is a long time ago already, against the Chinese, who have announced their desire to overtake us in essentially what is their own backyard, right? But they're doing more than their own backyard, of course. If you follow these things, it's worldwide. But getting back to the Titanic, this is really a good embodiment of the kind of way we think about things like this now. The Titanic was every technological development that you could put into a ship was in it. And it was something that Great Britain was very proud of. Now, of course, the captain of the Titanic, as you already know, ran the ship into an iceberg doing maximum speed, right? Which is, enough to ruin anybody's afternoon. And it wasn't really the ship's fault. It was the captain's fault for, your own internal pressure. We can talk about that some other time. As far as the captain made a bad decision, it was his responsibility. It was his fault. But we went into now a kind of naivete walking into the Titanic thing, where it didn't seem to bother anybody. I want you to think about this for a second, because this embodies a lot of other things afterwards. You got a ship that is capable of carrying, like, I don't know, they were probably allowed to carry almost 4,000 people, right? But the lifeboats were only required on the same ship, even if it had almost 4,000 people. The same rules and regulations said you only had to have lifeboats for about 900 people. See what I mean? So, you would have to ask yourself what existed that made that okay in the way of thinking of things when the Titanic went to sea. And afterwards, regulations got in and said, we have to make sure something like this doesn't happen again, right? So it gives you an idea of the way you look at things. There was a kind of technology was a godlike thing, right? It had seemed by 1910 that everything that could be invented was invented, right? And this is more of a psychological thing. It's more of a philosophical thing. That's why I'm actually taking this, because, the rest of it is just parts, The way we looked at things in 1910 is like, what else could possibly be invented? What else can possibly invent it? The United States, not just the United States, as a technical and industrial giant, we were producing things, and Europe was producing things that had conquered nature, and that was the big hinge point, that we had conquered nature. Not the least of which was powered flight, which was in its infancy. But essentially, you had broken gravity and something with a motor carrying a person. And that was the first time that had ever happened. It's something that, Leonardo da Vinci was trying to figure out, and everybody else. And here we're traveling around, seemingly with impunity, from continent to continent on these floating palaces. And there became kind of a contempt for nature. Like, what could possibly happen to us? And so the kind of awe and wonder about nature, right, and our place in it as something inferior in power actually got changed. And we became the masters of the universe right here at this moment. That's why it's so important to talk about the Titanic. It's not the Titanic. It's a ship, right? It's made out of metal. It sank. So, but the point I'm getting at is that the way that the world thought of things is that we became the masters of the universe. And in my opinion, as far as understanding the egos involved and the philosophy of the age, we became very, very arrogant. That you would just build a bigger machine or more powerful bomb or a bigger ship. And it's what else is there to be invented? No, we're unstoppable. And that was the thing that actually made the Titanic such a traumatic event. I mean, it's not like the Titanic was the first ship to sink. That wasn't it. But we had declared it, we, humanity, had declared it and us unstoppable. And nature, seemingly with a flick of her finger, stopped us. And it was a shock, a massive shock to the collective ego, right? Where maybe we're not as infallible as we thought we were, right? So it's one of these lessons, and that was the biggest one right at that moment. I mean, it really knocked everybody off their rocker, and we deserve to be knocked off our rocker from that standpoint. Now, when World War I started, right, in similar fashion, World War I, the naivete going into it was absolutely remarkable. Today, of course, if you're like me, or I talk about history all the time and politics all the time. I'm doing a focus on contemporary issues class right after this one in a couple of hours. So I got to watch the news all the time, right? Or as much as I can stand it. And believe me, sometimes I can't stand it. The naivete walking into World War I was that we were going to go and it was going to be this glorious thing, and the men were going to go marching off the war, and they're going to come back decorated with medals, and they're going to have stories to tell their grandchildren, and it's all going to be a very glorious thing. And it certainly was the way it was for the British and the Germans and the French, you see. And the United States had wrapped up this little war that was considered this grand little war called the War of 1898, better known as the Spanish-American War, you see. And, if you're taking somebody like Teddy Roosevelt, I mean, it was a bully little war. It was just great. This is what makes men men. Every generation should have this thing where they have to get on a ship and go to some foreign land and then fight people. And then, learn what it means to have masculine attributes. You see, and of course, we were always going to be on the winning side, and it's always going to be lopsided as far as the power was concerned. And so therefore, that's what was in the mind during this time, at least for Americans. Now, the Europeans, I mean, they were used to warring pretty much constantly. And it was something that, in contrast to Wilson, right, you have George Washington, right, who, when he was giving his farewell address, actually warned us about what Wilson did. And George Washington said, we have to be careful not to get involved in foreign entanglements. And he was talking about leaving the old world that was warring with itself since history became recorded and always would be. So George Washington looked at it like, we are a different breed over here. We're trying to do something else over here. And if we, Washington inferred, get involved in European politics, we will revert back to and become embroiled into what a few generations of people known to be Americans left there to try to get away from. And if you want to look at it like that, there are many, many parallels. You see, and Wilson's admonition that we needed to go back to Europe to save Europe, essentially, make it safe for democracy, right? That was the major hinge point of which was the trajectory that the United States is still on right now. Now, I'm not taking a position on that. I mean, I am not saying that we shouldn't have fought in World War I or heaven knows World War II. What I'm saying is it's very, very interesting to look at had the United States not intervened, not to be branded with the moniker of an interventionist or something like that, but it's my job to look at these things. Had Europe had a negotiated peace instead of the Treaty of Versailles, which was a very unfortunate document. And like I said to you, the Treaty of Versailles created the situation of such resentment on the part of the Germans. I mean, in 1919, when 1918 was rolling around, and into 1919, there was a young German soldier who was, this obscure corporal, Adolf Hitler, and whose eyes were bandaged up in the hospital because he had suffered a poison gas attack during the war. And he just couldn't believe that there was an armistice and that the Germans had essentially were making noises that they wanted to have peace. For somebody like Adolf Hitler, who found out for the first time in his life something that he meant something to him, somewhere he belonged, right? And Germany and the nationalism that went with it, to hand that over to the despicable enemy for no apparent reason, right? Because for the average soldier on the ground, if you were German, we were 50 miles from Paris. How did we possibly lose? You see? And right there, a whole generation of Germans vowed revenge. And they were looking, by the way, for scapegoats to find out who had stabbed Germany in the back. You see? Which, Exhibit A is the Jews, of course, to bring us back to the present time. But here you had a situation where if you were looking for a scapegoat, because after all, who were the men in striped pants, who were the intellectuals that aren't doing regular things that men do, like fighting a war or working for a living with their hands? Well, they're the Jews, right? Because historically, the Jews were driven to the perimeters of society because they were excluded from these things, and historically wound up becoming money lenders or, I don't know, lawyers or something, right? So therefore, it was those Jews who ran the banks, who really were the invisible strings in politics. So for an entire generation of Germans and others, and there were plenty of people right here in this country, even though we didn't lose, but it's very, very easy to look and say, well, the Jews run the media, they run the banks, they run the newspapers. So therefore, the Jews are really the ones who have all of the power, and they don't deserve it because they're reprehensible people, because they don't really work for a living. They just make money off of other people's money, right? And that sort of stuff. And certainly Adolf Hitler was able to make great hay with that, because there were plenty of people in Germany with the inflation, et cetera, that occurred right after the war, even before the Great Depression hit, where people wanted to have a scapegoat. They wanted to, why are we starving? Why did we lose World War One? And literally World War One and America's involvement in World War One made it possible for the Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles left it directly to World War II for the reasons I'm describing and more. Now, not the least of which consequences of World War One and the way it ended was the rise of Bolshevism, which Lenin took advantage of the politics of the day and the sentiment inside Russia about being in the war. And he was like, and kind of like in the way Hitler did, but Lenin was smarter than Hitler, and he was able to gain power. And then, of course, Bolshevism turns into flat out communism, you see, and that was something that we had to deal with. And they had to deal with us right up until the present moment, if you're including Maoist communism, which is the form that Xi Jinping is using right to this moment. You see, had World War One progressed differently during this time, it is plausible that these other things never would have got off the ground, not at least the way it did. You see, um, now when we talk about the Great Depression in the United States, we can see how actually that escalated the situation in Germany just through kerosene on the fire of people's discontent, right? So at this point, I just wanted to stop for a second and see if anybody had any question. I wanted to take a different angle on this than probably you have heard from, in the normal kind of discussion about this particular decade or even World War One for that matter. But that's one of the things that I want to offer you is something you probably haven't heard from before. And to give it a level of context that it makes the world we're living in today understand it a little bit more. Because the world we're living in today, even though it's the 21st century, and even though supposedly we're not in the modern era anymore, and we're not, we're in the postmodern era. And, the difference is the industrial revolution that I was talking about that led to machines like the Titanic. Now, of course, we have, other monster machines in the form of like artificial intelligence, right? And who knows what kind of iceberg that we're going to hit with that, if you don't mind my using that metaphor. I mean, personally, I'm a little, I'm a little skeptical about its ability to be co-opted for nefarious purposes, or maybe I've just become too cynical, or maybe I've just been studying history too long. But we are right at the other end of the string to this specific decade for all of the reasons why I'm discussing. All right. Not to be forgotten, I mentioned it before, but I'm going to go into a further detail about it, is the fall of the Ottoman Empire as a result of the end of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles created the world as we know it as far as the Middle East is concerned, right? So we had, there was this tremendous power vacuum in the entire region east of the Mediterranean that was the former Ottoman Empire. And the British, under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, were given control of this vast region that we now refer to as the Middle East. And it was British mandated Palestine, right? British mandated, and it was called mandated because the British were mandated to take care of it. So in other words, they were the cops, right? It wasn't really British territory, but the British were in control of the territory, you see. And there were countries that were literally just manufactured right at that point by a bunch of European white guys wearing striped pants, creating nation states, like Jordan and Iraq and things like that. So it is important to understand all sides of an issue, right? And without being attacked for being sympathetic for one side or the other. I'm a professional psychotherapist. It's my job to understand what makes people tick, whether I like them or not. If I'm going to help somebody communicate with somebody that they're in an adversarial position with, right? And oftentimes that might even be in marriage counseling. You have to understand what's making the other person think what they're thinking. If you have any hope of building a bridge, and I'm not looking at a Pollyanna-ish answer, but you can't even hope to do it if you're going to be dug into your point of view and not actually understand. That doesn't mean you have to agree with, but understand what the other people are mad about, you see. And, if you look at the Islamic world, it is like just prima facie, it like right on the face of it. It's who are you Western white imperialists to come over here where you were never invited and essentially just run our whole area and just draw lines on a map and then say it's a country and all the rest of this. So the kind of resentments that go on right to this very moment, not the least of which obviously is the state of Israel, is just seen as this unwanted usurpation of power, right? These outside interlopers who never really belonged in the Middle East and essentially had subjugated, an entire, I don't know if you would call it a culture or a race of people. Um, and it's kind of like a legitimate grievance. I'm not saying that I would have done something differently or when this was stupid. I'm just trying to understand the other side of an issue, you see. And the kind of stuff we've seen right now, I mean, as far as October 7th is concerned, regarding the attack by Hamas from Gaza into Israel, really roots right back to this very moment. And right in this period of time that we're talking about here, as today's presentation header is. It is the end of World War I. It is the British mandated Palestine. And even before that, it was the Balfour Declaration, where it began, where it's like, maybe people that are Jews should have a homeland in, well, what biblically it was promised by God in that region and a place called Israel. You see, so a lot of modern people today literally go back and they blame the British right back for exactly what we're talking about, where this whole thing started, and the British never had the right to do it, etc. And what made matters worse, as far as we were concerned, we the United States is concerned, is after World War II, the United Nations, in a brief moment in 1948, was the British mandated Palestine ended because the British wanted it to end. They handed this albatross around their neck to the United Nations, and the United Nations turned around and they said, well, we should have two states. And the state of Israel declared itself a nation. And my point to you is that what makes us the great Satan is that Harry Truman recognized the state of Israel right at that moment. And he didn't have to. As a matter of fact, he was advised against it, right? Not the least of which by the esteemed George Marshall, who was his Secretary of State, and said, Mr. President, don't do this. But Harry Truman did do it. And so therefore, if it wasn't for the United States, the state of Israel wouldn't exist. And for the continued support of the state of Israel, the United States has made that possible for Israel to exist. So therefore, if you hate Israel and you don't think Israel should be there, then you equally or even more hate the United States for the very same. You see, and that began right here in our period of time. So the ramifications of this, of course, can't be underestimated. And ditto that for what I was talking about, obviously, about Bolshevism and then subsequently communism, and then Asian communism. Another interesting thing that people don't know about this particular era is that we had a change in our own domestic constitutionalism as well. How many people know what the 17th Amendment is, right, without looking it up, right? It's one of these obscure things. 17th Amendment to the Constitution. And it has to do with the notion of kind of like this Jeffersonian versus Hamiltonian federalism. Okay, and what I mean by federalism, and this, let me define that right now, is the fact that to run a government, the federal government is running the government and the country in conjunction with states that are running their states and their state governments. You see, so when that happens together, right, it's federalism. I mean, there's certain responsibilities the states have, and there are certain responsibilities according to the Constitution that the federal government has. And if you're somebody who's kind of like a political wonk, and you're saying, well, the way that we run our country today is a lot different than it used to be. And the Constitution is under strain because it's running in a way that it wasn't designed to run. That goes directly to what I'm going to be talking about here about the 17th Amendment. And that was put into place in 1912 and ratified in 1913, right? So here's what it is. The way our upper house and the lower house was designed, right? In other words, the Senate and the House of Representatives is found as far as, to use a term the founding fathers were concerned, is that each individual state in our union was a sovereign entity, like the state of Connecticut, right? If you look at the state of Connecticut license plate, and on the bottom, unless you've got a vanity plate or something like that, well, not a vanity plate, but one of those specialized plates like veterans or something like that, right? We're caring for animals. What does it say? It says the Constitution state. You see, so Connecticut is essentially bragging that on a billboard that we had a constitution of our own here in Connecticut. You see, we were a sovereign government, right? A sovereign government. It was Connecticut, right? We had our own legislature, we had our own people, we had our own department of this and department of that, right? And a department of taking out the garbage. It was us. And in the old days, of course, there was a more of a regional character of things. So if you were from Connecticut, maybe the way that you did something as a Connecticut person, or your heritage as a Connecticut person, or somebody from New England, even more broadly, but would certainly be different than somebody like who was from Texas. You see, I don't think anybody would disagree with me about that, even in today's terms. And one of the things that gave it that local kind of a character, in a sense, was the Senate was going to have 2 senators for each state, right? As you know. So there's 50 states, there's 100 senators. And the senators were there to represent the state government, right? So the Senate was primarily to have a representation of what was important to that state in the federal government, you see. And to effect that, the senators were essentially appointed people by state legislatures, right? So it would have a distinct character state by state. And the House of Representatives, on the other hand, was there to represent the actual people, right? So the Senate is there to represent the state and the federal government, and the Congress, the lower house, the House of Representatives is there to actually represent the average person, you see? So therefore, there's going to be no, I don't know, to use a phrase, taxation without representation, see? So if I've got a congressperson, that means I'm represented in Congress. So, I mean, even if I don't agree with what's being voted on or even brought up by my congressperson, I can't say that I'm not represented. Then it becomes my job, if I don't like the policies of my congressperson, then to, I don't know, elect a different congressperson, right? But I can't say that I'm not represented. So the 17th Amendment took away the power of the state to appoint these people. And essentially, the senators became popularly elected, you see. So automatically what happened was, and certainly over the course of many decades, or the last 100 years or so, is that the nature of the senators really bringing forth the character and seeking the best interests of a specific state changed to what politicians need to do to get elected, which, generally means that you're going to do what you need to do to get elected, right? By a broader, constituency. And it changed the nature of federalism, right? Because the states essentially, like I said, you lost some of that character there, in my opinion. There are people even today saying, to really restore federalism, you would have to actually reverse the 17th Amendment thing, which of course ain't never going to happen. And, but the complaint is that the states now are really just mere secondary players to whatever the federal government wants to do. And we're so beholden on federal money that we essentially have sent to the federal government with our tax dollars. And now we're waiting like children at Halloween, hoping that the federal government's going to drop something in our trick or treat bag, you see. So therefore, we're all held hostages now by the federal government. So therefore, we're going to do whatever the federal government wants. And we have lost our independent sovereignty. So we're only sovereign in name only. Right. So if you're somebody who's a constitutionalist and you're lamenting that, our country and the way we're doing things is broken, you would be looking at something like this and saying this is one of the reasons why. Certainly, for my money, the World War I at this period of time was what had changed the United States forever. And it had, and Europe, of course, was changed forever. We'll talk about this more in the 1920s, about the fallout of what happened here, you see. But World War I had literally just blown people's minds. It had blown their minds. Now, I use that as a term. That's something I might have said back when I was in high school in the mid 1970s or something. But I mean, this is World War I knocked people off their rocker. Okay. And if you were somebody in government, if you were somebody who was an artist, if you were somebody who was a deep thinker or philosopher, this moment of World War I drove people to the level of saying that if World War I exists as it exists, with hundreds of thousands of people being mowed down a day, one day, in some crazy battle, how does God exist? Right? I've heard, similar kind of rhetoric by like after the Holocaust, right? So this is obvious. I mean, how can you say that God exists if God allowed this to happen to mankind? You see? And World War I was the first greatest example of this shift. And what I mean shift is it was an existential shift about the meaning of life, about the meaning of the universe, right? And generally speaking, and I know I'm speaking in generalities, but it's generally speaking, you looked to government, you looked to your king, your queen with a sense of reverence, a sense of knowledge and all being, righteousness in your cause that was unquestioned, and certainly it was all done in the name of God. I mean, it's certainly in the case like, Great Britain, where, the Church of England is essentially part of the government. And it was all wrapped together and for king and country. And here's my point. World War I blew that up. It blew it up. And that means that writers, if you've ever read, I don't know, Hemingway, all right, Or you look at a painter like, I don't know, Picasso or something. It was the beginning of this, all of the rules and all of the things that we look through and the reverence we had towards tradition. Obviously, it's meaningless. Everything's meaningless, right? So we had a kind of nihilism that occurred as a result of the trauma of World War One that led us into the modern age of essentially godlessness and nihilism, right? So if World War One makes sense, then nothing makes sense. And if nothing makes sense, then there are no absolutes. So therefore, I might as well just do what the hell I want, you see, because everything is meaningless, right? So the kind of, a classical painting, now you have different kinds of things. You have modern architecture, you have modern art, you have modern literature, you have all of these modern things, because right at that point, it was like taking the mold of everything that had been up to that point, right or wrong, and smashing it. Because if World War One was allowed to occur, then everything that we believed in, everything that we hoped in, everything that we were told was right is meaningless. And therefore we're gonna scrap it, and we're gonna start from scratch with modernism, you see. And that's something that, of course, in the 20s and 30s, that somebody like, I don't know, somebody like Hitler was able to look at and say, well, this is what's wrong with the world, in the Weimar Republic, or Weimar, if you prefer. This is a modern art is a symbol of the degradation of society, you see. And it's degradation of society, what to do we have to restore Germany back to its roots of the folkish nature of its people. So you had Nazi sponsored art where they went backwards, and only certain kinds of art form, right? It was kind of like a German version of I don't know, Norman Rockwell, and that's the only thing that was allowed, and everything else was seen as a cancer on society, right? And that's what scares a lot of people today whenever you have similar language that says, we should go back to this, or this new stuff, whatever it is culturally. This is a cancer on our society, and it's going to spell the end of our identity and all that was good. So we should really put this in a box and go back to this over here, and this was better. It's easy to make the parallel and say, that sounds like what Hitler did, you see. And those are the same kind of rhetorical tools and propaganda-esque tools that are used right at this moment to great effect, right or wrong. I'm just pointing out the mechanism. I'm not placing a value on it. So let's go out to the audience. I want to get some feedback from you, and let me know what you think. And if you have any questions, you want me to expand on any of the points that I just made. So let's open it up right now and see if anybody's got any points or questions you'd like to have answered.
So Art, we have one question in the chat by Rick. He goes, I wonder how great industrialists played a part in history, specifically Henry Ford.
Well, the interesting thing about Henry Ford is, we can touch base with Henry Ford right from I talked about the Model T in our last program. And there's nothing that embodies modernism in a microcosmic sense like the Titanic. The Titanic would have been a macrocosm. The Model T is a microcosm, right? But it's the same thing. It's technology. It's the ability to build something. It's machine made and handmade at the same time. And it's something that is used for transportation, right? And it's not only that, but it's kind of a novel thing. Now, Henry Ford as an individual was a person of his age that fit a small group of people like Henry Ford, right? Teddy Roosevelt was like Henry Ford in some respects, right? Not all respects. And this is what these industrialists had sort of in common. Not all of them, but some of them, right? I'm going to take kind of like this psychosocial look at it first. There was a feeling by those who were in the privileged classes, all right, and Henry Ford actually became part of a privileged class, who felt as though that by the time that 1910 had rolled around or 1915 had rolled around, the world had become too soft. It had become too flaccid, right? You know how today, like, I mean, today, people were looking at people like if you look at the numbers of how many 20-year-olds already have type 2 diabetes because they're obese, or people are stuck behind their computer screens and they don't go outside. So, and you know, kids don't want to go into the trades or something because it's too much work or too dirty or this or that or the other thing, right? Even 100 years ago, somebody like Henry Ford was saying that our country and our society has become too flaccid. We've become too used to creature comforts, and we should go and we should live in the woods and hike and rough it, and that's the part about this that Teddy Roosevelt liked, so it was sort of like this return to masculinity and toughness, that sort of a thing. And Henry Ford, right? Henry Ford was, not of course Teddy Roosevelt, but there was that. Number one. Number two, Henry Ford, as far as society was concerned, Henry Ford saw himself as a progressive, right? So I'm taking my time to explain this because it's a contradiction, right? It's a contradiction. It's really a paradox, Henry Ford, because he wanted to make, in the term that we would use today, social justice. He wanted to make something like the Model T available to every single person, right? So if you were just the guy who was putting on the lug nuts on the wheels of a Henry Ford Model T, you weren't exactly, the highest person on the totem pole in society. But Henry Ford felt that you should be earning enough and the car should be economical enough that you, the simple worker in the middle class, should be able to afford to buy a Model T. And it was a very, very novel concept. The first time in history, world history, that this really occurred. And Henry Ford was sort of at the forefront of it, right? So this is the first society that ever existed, our society, where there was literally a structured work week, where at least it was to become that, and where you could actually take a Sunday drive, which means that you had a certain level of affluence. I don't mean that you're rich. What I mean is affluence in time. This specific period of time, this switch over from the agricultural world into the, I don't know, the semi-urban or urban built environment, right, means that the whole world had changed, or it was rapidly changing, where 50 years before 1910 or 1915, 50 years before, the average person's life was revolving around when the sun came up and when the sun went down, and whether or not you were going to get your crops in, and whether or not you were going to get out there and feed the cows and milk the cows and do whatever other things that people do with animals on farms and all the rest of that. And if there was a plague of locusts that come in, and then you were going to be starving after all of that work was done. And it was also true that probably 3 out of your 4 kids were going to die from some childhood disease before they were 4 years old. I mean, all of that was just normal. It was just a world of just brutal labor and heartbreak. But by the time that the Henry Ford Model T rolled along, it really represented a massive change in society for us, particularly the Americans, because I mean, when before in history did you have excess fuel to put in a car and drive around for no other reason than to drive around? You see what I mean? I mean, this is a major hinge point, right up to this present day, right? Certainly the kind of affluence that we have, you see. But if you went to Europe or something like that, I mean, even we were talking about World War One and World War Two, but World War Two specifically, to jump ahead a little bit. I mean, World War Two, one of the advantages that the average American GI had, the American Army, if you will, was that the average American, if you were between 17 and 20 years old in World War II, you probably had tinkered around with some jalopy, or you had some beat up old Model A or something, and you grew up on a farm and you were used to, repairing farm equipment, you see. And when stuff broke in the field in Europe, the average American GI could get out there with a wrench and figure out if it was the carburetor or if it was this or if it was that. And the Germans, they couldn't do that. You had to wait for the technicians to come in and repair whatever it was that broke. And that's one of the remarkable things about the Model T, and what Henry Ford was actually benevolent in this regard, right? On the other hand, the part that's a paradox is that Henry Ford was one of these people who looked at, in a eugenics sense, right, which was all the rage right here at this time, by the way, eugenics. And it was very far and wide in our country, which was that there were people who were worth having value and there were people who were less worth, you see, from a biological standpoint. Another big thing that went on here during this period of time, in this decade, right, was the kind of like the application to society through so-called science and education of what was all the rage, which was Darwinism, right? And Darwinism said that there are creatures that are just superior to other creatures. There are creatures, if you've got two male, whatever, big animals with antlers, and there's one female animal, there's these two male animals are going to go at it until one's dead, and then the other one's going to get to mate with the female animal, and then your DNA is going to be extended into the future, the survival of the fittest. During this specific period of time, and the United States was right at the forefront of this, we applied this to society in this very scientific way, you see. And it's called social Darwinism, right? So some people are worth it and some people aren't. Some people are better, some people aren't. Some people should get the rationed thing because they're going to have a greater chance of survival, or because they're superior by some ridiculous scientific sounding judgment, then they should get that because they deserve it. Right now, Henry Ford saw, as Hitler did, Jewish people, for instance, as a race of people, and he saw them as parasitic on the soul of America, as did, in African Americans. So, as the Unter mentioned, if you couldn't control these other aspects of society, then they were going to infect everything and they were going to take over, probably like parasites. And Henry Ford, of course, was one of those people. And but our notion of social justice today is very much different, right? Henry Ford wanted to create, factories with smokestacks billowing, because that represented that he was going to bring the middle class up, you see, because the more stuff that you built and the more smoke you put into the air meant that your products were going to be more mass produced and they were going to become cheaper and they were going to become more available. And life saving and labor saving devices were going to be made available to people who never would have dreamed of having them, stuff that only rich people could have. You see, today we look at social justice and we say, well, I don't know, that factory over there with 3 smokestacks, that's right next to the black section of town. So therefore, the smoke is being inhaled disproportionately by people of color, and therefore the factory is racist. You see, that's the way. So, social justice is kind of flipped, you see, from this standpoint. As far as other industrialists are concerned, you've got Andrew Carnegie and Steele and all the rest of that. We talked about that from the turnover from the 19th into the 20th centuries, but we had some trust busting going on, and the government, the federal government, in a harbinger of things to come, was starting to look at, Teddy Roosevelt did this, we talked about that, was looking at monopolies, right? And we were going to do something called trust busting. And we were going to make it so that like a handful of men couldn't control the entire planet because they were so vertically integrated that they controlled the means of production, all of the supply chain, all of the retail chain. And therefore they were going to literally just they were going to coordinate with each other to essentially become masters of the universe. Okay, I would argue that we have literally the same thing right now with high tech, right? I'm talking about the Googles of the world. I'm talking about the Facebooks of the world, and how, I can't be on the program on that I'm on right now with essentially just giving a nod to, the policies of these companies and what they know about me and what they don't know about me. And essentially, I can't do this independently because I'm not going to run my own computer company, you see, and my own intranet, right? So we have literally a direct parallel to the kind of large control, monopolistic masters of the universe, if you will, of the Carnegies and the Standard Oils, right? And the huge corporations that you had back in the day. We certainly have that right now in the technology sphere. All right. It is an absolute fascinating turn of events, an absolutely fascinating turn of events. And I think that some of the power that some individuals have in this world today, I think that they are more powerful than a Rockefeller ever would have even dreamed of having. And so that's a fascinating point, as far as, these big industrialists, et cetera. Right. And then, of course, this is also a period of time, and this existed up until the 1960s and the 1970s, where, lamentably, that's not even a strong enough term. I mean, nobody really thought too much about what was being dumped in the river. You know what I mean? If you had some kind of a toxic byproduct, then, look at General Electric and like Schenectady and all the rest of that. And New York State was getting General Electric to have to clean up the PCBs from the bottom of the Hudson River for, literally decades. And there's no way you're all going to get them. So from the standpoint of what that did to the world, you would have to ask yourself the question, well, was our lifestyle and our military industrial complex like worth it, right? So, that's one of the questions that's being asked even right now in a more modern term about what we're doing, so when I was working on naval vessels, many of the ships that I were working on were World War II construction, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, even construction. And they had to come in and they had to slap stickers on everything that had toxic materials in it. I was around an environment where it's like, there was asbestos everywhere I looked. And as long as it was painted and as long as it was sealed, it was okay, but nevertheless, that is something that is what started off as a miracle mineral. It became like this fantastic um, cancer-causing agent. And so, and also PCBs, right? The aforementioned PCBs, polychloral something. I'm sorry, I forgot. But they had to put these huge stickers on like every piece of equipment that had PCBs, because this way, at least you knew you were standing in front of something that had PCBs in it. Like I used to laugh about it, like, all right, so now I know there's PCBs in it. Now what? You know, what does that mean? Don't lick it? What does that mean? So and but the kind of pollution that was generated by our expansion in the industrial realm, the development of chemicals, the development even of railroads, um, even the expansion by today's standards of, I don't know, railroading certainly during the 1910s and other roads. I mean, today we would look at it and say, well, how many Indians did we throw off this land to be able to put this railroad through here? And that certainly back in those days wasn't much of a consideration, or it certainly doesn't seem like it was. All right. And so there's been tremendous attitude changes from the standpoint of the way we look at things. I mean, sometimes I think that we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater to the point where we're so careful about things that we're paralyzed. Yet at the same time, there is so much politics involved in everything that issues like the ones I'm discussing, in my opinion, are used for political power. Okay, so therefore, that's why they're made issues. Not to say that the original issue doesn't exist, but they're deliberately manipulated and exacerbated to lever something besides the subject matter, which is actual power, political and economic power. And that's just the way it works. But pollution was a big thing. I mean, right up to the time where I was a child. I mean, I grew up across the street from the water, and 1960s in boatyards and stuff, which I was every day because I loved old wooden boats and hung out there every single day. There was a lot of marinas right where I lived, and people, whatever it was, the turpentine, rags, whatever, right in the water, right in the water. Everything was in the water. Nobody even. It didn't seem like anybody even thought about it. And within, certainly my young adulthood, a lot of that changed with the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. And it's right up to the point where when I worked on the Intrepid in the 1990s, a river that had been devoid of marine life for decades and decades and decades, we were having a problem because those ancient piers over on the west side of Manhattan, the ones that held, the famous ocean liners and stuff, where the Intrepid up here, 86 now was, we were having a problem because that ancient pier, which was stable for decades, was now starting to fall apart. And the reason why it was falling apart was because marine life was returning to the Hudson River. So little organisms that eat wood came back because the river got cleaner. Right. So paradoxically, now you had, these pilings that were in the river for God knows how many decades and were always stable, where now they weren't stable because the critters were back, you see, and they were starting to eat the wood. Right. And so there was really a positive sign that the marine life had come back into an environment where you never thought it would ever could come back. You see, so that is something that, for as far as progressivism is concerned, is very positive. It is very positive. Who else had a question?
So Rick wanted to just say thank you for your analysis on Henry Ford. But Bill had a question about how significant were the Zeppelins?
Mm. Well, Zeppelins were a good idea until 1936, right? What happened in 1936 that made Zeppelins like all of a sudden not a good idea? The Hindenburg, right? Right after the Hindenburg crash, it exploded, of course. After that, it was like, I was going to take one of these things over to Europe, and it seemed like a great idea. Thank you very much. Now I think I'll take the Queen Mary, right? So that was like That was like the 3 Mile Island for dirigibles, right? So you got dirigibles, you've got Zeppelins named after von Zeppelin, the guy who invented the thing. So you essentially have a rigid structured airship filled with these balloons of lighter than air gas. All right. And if you don't know, there's only two of those such gases. There's helium and there's hydrogen that are practical to use. So if you pump enough of these gas that's lighter than air, well, the airship lifts off the ground, right? And then you have these big motors on the side. And the Germans actually invented like this aerial bombing. Did you know that Paris was bombed from the air and from during World War I? So it literally was the harbinger of things to come. Once you had really heavier than air aircraft, you had this strategic way of looking at it and saying, well, hell, we're not even going to need an army anymore or a navy if there's ever going to be another great war, because we'll just bomb the hell out of them. And because our enemies know that we're going to bomb the hell out of them, they're never going to go to war with us. So in other words, if we have enough bombers, then there won't be any more war. You see, obviously that was another thing that didn't exactly come to pass like that. But Zeppelins, well, they were used for observation. But the problem with Zeppelins is you could shoot down a Zeppelin, right? So if you have a German Zeppelin, right, and that means that now your enemy has to find a way to counter your Zeppelin, right? The British, the French. And so now you're going to shoot down the Zeppelin, right? And now I'll give you a good example, right? The Zeppelin would be like something that helped to initiate air-to-air combat, right? And look at it this way. You had one of the things that everybody was always hoping for, right? Even let's go to the American Civil War, right? And if you want to look at World War I, it was like the American Civil War in a sense, as far as the amount of people that were involved and the amount of people that were getting killed without the modern weapons. And then you have World War I, and you add the kind of carnage that we had in the Civil War, except now with a machine gun and tanks and poison gas, right? And that sort of a thing. But how do you find out where your enemy is, right? Are they trying to flank you on the left? Or are they trying to flank you on the right? You see, so as far as lighter than air aircraft are concerned, right, the first thing that they started to use, and you even had this, they tried doing this in the Civil War, but in World War I, let's stick with that, right? You put some guy in a chair, and then the balloon lifts off, and then you're way high up in the air. And you're looking, and you're like, yeah, you're drawing stuff down on a map. You're not taking your smartphone out and taking a picture of, oh, look, the Allies have made a trench over here and they're moving to the east or they're moving to the west, right? You always wanted to have an aerial picture of what your enemy wanted to do. You see? So they developed these cameras that could be used actually, right? These aerial cameras. And because they were so heavy, these guys in the balloons, they were just these lonely guys up there that were freezing to death anyway. All right. But they started to have aircraft, the Germans and the British started to have aircraft so they could actually put cameras in them, right? And you would have one guy in the back and he'd hang the camera out and you would take pictures of the trench lines because it was a static war in the sense that it was a stalemate. So as soon as, and everybody's trying to get an advantage, and you wanted to find out what your enemy's advantage was, and the only way you could do that was by reconnaissance, hence the camera, hence the airplane, hence the aerial view, right? So aerial combat started from this regard because you don't want your enemy taking pictures of what you're doing. So then you decide to get yourself some airplanes to shoot down their airplane that's taking pictures. Now, those poor guys up there with the camera, right? And I mean that rhetorically, those poor guys, right? They didn't have guns first. They were just there to take pictures. So now the guys on the side with the pictures have to put two airplanes up there. One airplane with the camera and another plane with guns. So that means that when I come to shoot down the camera airplane, their guy is going to be there to shoot at me. So I don't kill the camera guy. And that was the beginning of aerial dogfighting. Okay. With people shooting at each other from the airplanes. And of course, we used warfare in World War I, particularly, but not exclusively. It's always been kind of a shame, a humanistic shame, essentially, where the greatest efforts of man's creativity has gone into more efficient ways of killing our fellow man. Okay, I don't mean to sound like a sermon or something stupid like that, but it happens to be a fact, and I'm afraid it still is. And we know how better ways to kill each other than we know practically anything else. And it seems like that trend isn't going to stop anytime soon, right? I don't want to get too depressing for you before Thanksgiving, or maybe it'll be good because on Thanksgiving we could say, hey, there's a lot of things for me to be thankful for, which there are, I'm sure, if you just look around. With the Zeppelins, yeah, I mean, they made them bigger and bigger, and kind of like the ships of the day. The airships took their terminology from the ocean-going vessels. If you look at the terminology of airships, I mean, just ship itself, right? All of the terminology involved, it's all nautical in a sense, because what analogy did they have but from a ship, right? And even when airplanes like heavier than air aircraft come, what did they call them? They called them airliners, right? Kind of like taken after ocean liners, right? So there's a very long trajectory of this kind of traditional stuff in all of that. But, lighter than air aircraft seemed like a good idea, and it was progressing along just fine. In the same way that nuclear energy was progressing along just fine until 3 Mile Island, right? And all of a sudden, it's like, maybe these nuclear reactors are dangerous, and all of a sudden, after 1979, all of these approvals for nuclear power plants dried up. And the Hindenburg had the same effect on dirigibles. By the way, the difference between a dirigible and the blimp is a blimp actually is it's like a big balloon, and it's sewn into a certain shape, right? That's a blimp, like the Goodyear blimp and all the rest of that. It's like a big blimp, and it has a gondola on the bottom, right? And the thing loses air, it just drops like a flat tire, And but a dirigible is a rigid structured thing, and it has these huge bags inside that are expanded with some kind of a lighter than air gas. What happened with the Hindenburg, essentially, to jump forward to 1936, is the Hindenburg was built, of course, by the Nazis. And, they were showing the swastika wherever they were, and it came over. There was a lot of guys that told me, a lot of old timers that told me, oh, I saw the Hindenburg come over Bridgeport. They took us out of class. It was very interesting. And we had a corner on the market of helium, right? The United States of America, right? And because it could be used for an airship, which could be used for observation, it was considered a strategic material that we weren't going to sell to an adversary. So we didn't sell it to Germany, right? So Germany was forced to use something that the other gas that is very lighter than air, right? Which was helium, which was hydrogen. The problem with hydrogen is that it's extraordinarily flammable. You see, the Germans took the risk, and whatever happened to the Hindenburg happened to the Hindenburg. The hydrogen just exploded into the massive fireball that it was. But that was pretty much it. It seemed like a good idea, actually, pretty efficient. You've got something to keep you at altitude, which was a lighter than air gas. And then you just sort of propel yourself along by these 4 engines or however many engines there were. I mean, it actually seemed like it was really relatively efficient, Now, as far as warfare is concerned, we used blimps for and airships the United States did for observation on the East Coast, certainly during World War I and World War II, right? Especially during World War II, because in World War II, we had German submarines right off the coast. Well, what do you know? It's 3:31. So anything else before we go?
Yeah, does anyone else have any other questions for Art before we leave?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, Rick wanted to say he really appreciates your time, and you are like a mortar between historical events of our lives.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It means a lot to me. And I'm thankful, of course, and I mean this, I'm not just saying it. It's a privilege spending this time with you and be able to spend some time with, people who are, I'm sure, as interested in this sort of thing as I am. And it's enriching my life. All right. So God bless you all. I'll see you in 2 weeks. All right.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much again, Art, for your time. Everyone, our next session will be December 6th at 2 p.m. Due to the Thanksgiving Day holiday, the session will be posted to our YouTube page at a later date. So please keep an eye out on in your emails for that link. Once again, thank you all so much for coming. We hope you enjoy your holiday, and we will see you all very soon. Thank you
Thank
again.
you. Bye.
Bye now.